Pub Politics Public Roundtable. And since this is a public event, I'd like to begin in the traditional way of acknowledging the owners of this land where we gather and meet, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who I might not have met, my name is Tim Dunne. It's my pleasure to be, and my privilege to be a professor of political science in this fantastic school of political science and international studies that's very well represented on the panel, among very notable guests who I'll come to in a moment. So you'll have noticed that the theme is about images and how images matter. And I guess one of the questions I had in my mind when I was thinking about today's roundtable is really how it is that we've reconjoined, if you like, images and politics, and when did they ever get separated, and how did they get separated? I'm sure these are themes that a number of the panel members may be addressing or may have addressed in the last day and a half of their workshop activities. So Roland's asked me to ensure that he goes first, because he's going to speak a bit about the project and how the project hangs together. And then after, I think most of you are familiar with Roland, but if you're not, Professor Roland Bleiker is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies here at UQ in the School of Political Science and International Studies. And next to him, Emma Hutchison is a research fellow in the school. She's done some outstanding work, including publishing a fantastic Cambridge book in 2016 on the emotions, and I forget the title. It has Effective Communities in the title.
Female Politics, yeah.
That's good. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I do recommend it to everyone. It has a brilliant cover and the contents are just as good. Which is not true in all cases. And next to Emma is Associate Professor MacKenzie from the University of Sydney. And Megan's written very widely on women in conflict situations, and she's very active on social media and has written a number of fantastic things which I've read and enjoyed. So thank you, Megan, for coming. Next to Megan is Lene Hansen, and Lene is from the University of Copenhagen, where she's a professor of political science. Lene is really an outstanding researcher in the area of political science methods, in the area of visual politics, and a number of fantastic books that Lene has written. I was also fortunate to be able to collaborate with Lene on the European Journal of International Relations, and if any of you got rejected in the time that we were editors, it wasn't me, it was Lene. And actually that probably is, looking at the data, that probably is correct. And next to Lene is Simone. Simone is a PhD in political science at Copenhagen, working on images and international security. So, and you've been visiting here and part of this project, which is fantastic. And next to Simone is my old friend Michael Williams, who we always call each other for some reason Professor. I'm sure he started it. But Mike Williams is a very well-known figure, as you know, for those of you in international relations, a towering figure really in the discipline, written fantastic works on theory and on stuff, on political thought. And in fact, instead of doing proper research this afternoon, the only thing I actually managed to do was to go to rate my professor, because I was desperate to see what they said about Michael. I was obviously looking for some really terrible stuff, and this is what I found. Professor Williams is an absolute riot. He's hilarious and conveys political philosophy in a way I never imagined possible. His readings are the longest I've had, so this is starting to get a bit dark at this point. His readings are the longest I've had for any class, but whatevs, he's the best. So actually, the whatevs, he's best was something I just added. But it's great to have Michael here visiting. He's an old friend. It's really nice to see you, as is Lene and other people. So I'm going to hand over at this point to Roland, who's going to tell us how this all hangs together.
So thanks very much, Tim, for the introduction. Thanks also, I have to say, to the faculty and Tim for the support for our visual politics research program. It's been giving us a fantastic opportunity to get people together from across the faculty, across the university, and really do interesting work. Now, for those of you who might not know, this is just, we have seminars, workshops, or roundtable like that, workshops, work in progress events. They're public. We have a website, we have a Twitter account, Facebook account, so if you don't know, please join us, and you're always welcome to any of the events that we're having. Now, my task for today is really just to contextualize a little bit what we're doing. We've done a workshop yesterday. Simone has done a fantastic job organizing it. Prof has helped us in a fantastic way with all the organizational things, so big thanks to the two of them. The workshop is around the theme of how images matter. It seems in some sense an odd question, because obviously images matter. No one questions that. You know, scholars don't, the public don't. Images of terrorism, for instance, they are obviously very political. In fact, terrorist attacks are by essence designed for visual impact. They're not designed for physical impact, they're designed for visual impact, for media circulation, to project fear, images of war, images of humanitarian crisis. They are all political in nature, and they shape how we understand the events, how we then go on basically responding to them. But it is a lot more difficult to actually ascertain how exactly they matter. You know, what their impact is, what the exact politics is, and that's sort of what we've done yesterday to sort of brainstorm from different vantage points how images exactly matter. In social science, the conventional way of understanding impact is by causal methods, you know, X causes Y. With images, that's much more tricky. We're not going to find a lot of examples that tell us images cost X. So there's some examples, I'm going to just mention a couple of them. A recent example is from our much beloved new President of the United States, Donald Trump, who, as opposed to quite a few reports, changed his policy and launched missile attacks on Syria as a result of having seen atrocious images of the chemical attack on civilians. So we see an image basically changing the mind of Trump. Not that that's happened very often, but in this case, definitely it seems to have done. Then we talked yesterday quite a bit about the case of Alan Kurdi. Helen Behrens did that, for instance, how about a year and a half ago, an image of a 3-year-old dead boy on a beach in Turkey, a refugee boy, basically generated massive discussions across Europe on refugees. Some would even say changed policies, that the German government changed its policies, at least temporarily, to a more progressive stance on refugees as a result of that image. So again, we see an image basically causing a political event. And the last examples we discussed, or one of them was the wall of icons. Lene and Megan have talked about that, and we can think, for instance, of Abu Ghraib, the torture pictures at Abu Ghraib. Everyone knew that torture was happening in the context of 9/11, in the context of the rendition program. Amnesty had a big report out, no one really cared. All of a sudden, images emerged of Abu Ghraib, images that saw an American soldier engaging in torture, and then all of a sudden there's a massive outcry, you know, this is outrageous, this is terrible, you know, they were not necessarily changing policy immediately, but definitely a massive debate. Even though there was absolutely no new information. The only new thing was the visual. Now these are examples that are fairly rare. Examples where we can see an image causes either public changes in attitude or causes changes in policies. In most cases, images work much more indirectly. I'll give you an example here of 9/11. Again, the entire attack of 9/11 was designed for visual impact. You know, the attack on the Twin Towers, the immediate circulation of images around the world, still in moving ones, had a tremendous impact on public perceptions. It undoubtedly contributed to the emergence of the good versus evil culture in the US. It contributed to the war on terror, but we can't really ascertain causal mechanisms that link them. So we got together and said, like, how else can we really theorize images, their significance, their impact, their role? And each of us now is going to take about 8 minutes to make 1 or 2 points about how we've done that. And I'm going to use my last 2 minutes or so that I have to make 1 point. And that is the need for interdisciplinary research and the need to rely on multiple methods. Images work in very complex ways, different levels of analysis. They work from the individual to the state level, they work in our minds, they work in public spaces. We have to understand the construction of images, the content of images, the impact of images, extremely complex. There's no one method that could possibly assess this. So we need things like discourse analysis and semiotics and content analysis, interviews, quantitative surveys. We need basically methods across the quantitative and qualitative spectrum. The problem, of course, is, you know, most of us are not trained, or rarely any of us is trained to actually be competent in all of these methods. In addition, and again we talked about that yesterday, there's this unnecessary hostility between quantitative and qualitative work, and they're associated with different epistemological positions. So my suggestion would be sort of to push this in 2 ways, to actually embark as individuals in multiple methods, to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone and do different things. And Lene has presented a fantastic paper yesterday combining content analysis, quantitative content analysis with qualitative discourse analysis. Something people usually don't do, something that's sort of frowned upon almost, but to look at the same event in different ways. But we should also collaborate, with people from outside our discipline. And ultimately, that's the key objective of our visual politics research program. We have around 50 people across campus involved in it from completely different disciplines. And the idea is that for us to talk to people who would usually not only be in conversation, but then actually to engage in collaboration, between computer science and art historians, or between anthropologists and political scientists, or psychologists and architects, to really push our understanding of what knowledge is, what method is. That's not easy. In my experience, that's what I talked about yesterday. We collaborated, Emma and I and David Campbell, with social psychologists. At the beginning, we didn't even have a language to communicate. We just couldn't figure out what we were saying. So we had to really learn how to talk to each other, how to find out how to design the project, how to execute it, and then how to present it. But to me, that's the key point. We need a lot more interdisciplinary research. We need to be pushed outside of our comfort zone and find new ways of looking at the complex role of images.
That's great. Great stuff.
Thank you to all of you for coming. It's lovely to see so many people. The question of how images matter in world politics is a very important question, but it's also a very broad and a very difficult question. And considering that I only have 8 minutes, I'll try to make my answer to this question a little more concrete by relating it to a project that I'm working on at the moment, namely a project on the Islamic State's use of imaging. So what I'm going to do is the next 8 minutes is first say a few words about my research, the images that I focus on, and then afterwards I'll try to make 2 more general arguments about how images matter in world politics based on the work I've done on the Islamic State's images. Okay, so the first step. My current research focuses on the role of images during the war against the Islamic State. More specifically, the visual phenomenon that I'm interested in and that I'm studying is this public spectacle, or almost global spectacle, that the Islamic State has created through their use of imagery and their orchestration of various public displays of violence. As you've probably noticed, the Islamic State has become a quite prominent topic both within political debates, public debates, but also within academia the last 3 years. There's already been produced a lot of research on the group's military capabilities, how they have taken over territory, their ideology, their history, how they relate to other groups. But my argument is that the war against the Islamic State is not only a military conflict taking place in a territorial battle space. It's also a global war of images taking place in a more virtual battle space. And the political significance and power of the Islamic State phenomenon lies not only in the group's ability to take territory, it also lies in the group's ability to shape political representations and public imaginaries on the global stage through imagery. During the last 3 years, we have continuously been confronted with images produced by the Islamic State, particularly the group's videos of killings, violence, executions have been recurrent motives in the public sphere. And in public discourse, these images are very often described as an exceptional form of evil, as a violence we've never seen before, as beyond anything we've ever seen brutality. But my argument is that this is actually not exceptional brutality, it's not exceptional violence. Political agents have been producing this kind of violence and staging this kind of violence throughout centuries. So for me, what's really exceptional about the Islamic State case is this: the public visibility of the acts and this global spectacle they've created. Because the Islamic State's ability to make their acts visible across national, cultural, and linguistic borders is quite remarkable. Many contemporary combatants produce horrific conduct horrific acts of violence, but few, if any, have received this kind of visibility that the Islamic State has received. And as some of you may know, the Islamic State has put together a quite sophisticated professional media campaign that relies on a very professional understanding of modern media and network communication and professional filmmaking. And unlike previous militant groups whose videos have often been described as rather boring, the Islamic State has been really good at producing material that's suited for our contemporary, fast-paced communication environment. And what's really significant about this group is that they're actually quite independent from traditional communication elites. So while previous militant and terrorist groups were dependent on being picked up by media organizations and get them to publicize their acts, the Islamic State is communicating directly with various audiences onto more global immersive platforms on which they're increasingly outmaneuvering traditional communication elites. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that what's significant about the Islamic State is not the brutality or the willingness to use violence, it's the public visibility of their acts and the global spectacle they created. Put differently, the case of the Islamic State shows that militant groups are becoming remarkably skilled at mobilizing the power of modern media and new visual technologies to communicate with a global audience through imagery. And this takes me to the second part of my presentation, because what can this case of the Islamic State's global spectacle teach us about the role of images in world politics? A lot, I would argue, but I'm going to limit myself to 2 key points. First of all, the Islamic State spectacle, global spectacle, can teach us something about what effective political communication looks like in our contemporary fast-paced communication environment. Because if you look at how studies of political communication usually study political communication, they very often focus on text. They focus on political speeches, public documents, newspaper articles, reports, and so forth. But the Islamic States, they do not communicate through text, they communicate through images. And they're really, really successful at doing this. 88% of the group's communication is visual. And their products normally include colorful magazine, high-definition videos, various kinds of photo series. And if you look to the content of the videos, you'll see that they rarely show long scripted speeches, but they're filled with extreme violence, spectacular performances, and a very carefully choreographed iconography. So I think personally that the mistake people make when they try to analyze or try to counter these kind of images is that they think this is about information. Government agencies think they have to counter bad information and give better information through counter narratives. But the effects of the Islamic State's media campaign, and any kind of media campaign like this, is not just about information, it's much more about spectacular images and the emotions that particular visual performances engender. And this also poses a challenge for IR, because if you look at how IR normally study political communication, you'll see that scholars very often rely on methodologies that focus on interpretation. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense if you're focusing on textual practices. But when we're dealing with communication like the Islamic State's images, we're working with this kind of approach we usually have may not be sufficient, because we're dealing with something that works on a more emotional level. So when groups like the Islamic State are becoming better at communicating through images, we have to rethink the methodologies we usually use to study political communication. So that's my first point. The second point I'm going to make before I'm going to stop, and the second point I'm going to go over the work I've done on the Islamic State, is essentially relates to the question of political power. More specifically, where important political action takes place during contemporary global conflicts. Because why is the Islamic State a powerful political agent? Since the launch of Operation Inherent Resolve, they've suffered huge military defeats. They've lost a lot of territory. Basically, they're not doing a very good job on the territorial battlefield. But as I just said, the power of the Islamic State is not only about the group's military capabilities, it's much about the group's ability to shape political imaginaries on a global stage through imagery. And if we look at current events, we see that the Islamic State is actually still doing pretty well. Capturing attention, taking credit for attacks they have no relation to, mobilizing different groups, spurring strong reactions. So the Islamic State as an organization may be suffering, but the Islamic State as a brand and an image, I would argue, is still relatively strong. And the reason why it's still relatively strong is because they're really good at communicating on some new platforms, new, more virtual platforms that where they're actually doing quite well compared to how they're doing on the territorial battlefield. So the more general argument I'm trying to make here is that because of the way images circulate today, and because of the way new visual technologies have mobilized new groups like the Islamic State, it's necessary to pay close attention to some more virtual battle spaces and some new, some new communication platforms that we usually don't study. And because for me, politics does not just happen in government buildings or at the territorial battlefield, it also happens in these new virtual platforms and new media spheres that doesn't really exist any methodologies for studying at the moment. Okay, so the argument that I've made is that the case of the Islamic State shows that militant groups are becoming remarkably skilled at mobilizing the power of modern multiple media and new visual technologies to communicate with audiences, global audience through imagery. And my argument is that poses two more general questions for the study of world politics. First of all, about what effective political communication looks like in our contemporary fast-paced communication environment, and secondly, where important political action takes place during global conflicts.
Thank you so much to Roland and Simone for organizing this event. This is the third time that I'm here at the University of Queensland, and it's just such a pleasure to be here. I'm very impressed that so many people come out on a Friday afternoon, even though the drinks reception will be offered non-alcoholic drinks. So
and the term break too.
And during term break. Okay, what I'll do in the 8 minutes that I have is that I have 4 slides. I was thinking about this morning based on the conversations we had yesterday about the different ways in which that we can get theorized images such that they matter in world politics, 4 suggestions or 4, let's say, both clusters of research but also challenges that come, that this agenda is about. And I think it fits both with what Simone was talking about, but also what Roland was saying about the relationship between method, epistemology, ontology, and both the need to be pluralistic in terms of that, but also some of the challenges that pluralism can create. So, okay, there'll be 4 slides, 2 minutes each. The first way that I think we talk about how images matter in world politics is that we talk about what I would call visual counterfactuality. A lot of the last 10 years work on images in IR have been sort of starting from the CNN effect and the shortcomings thereof. So for those of you who remember as far back as 1991, with the CNN coverage of the first Gulf War, was an assumption that media would drive policy, put very simply. So that involves sort of a causality, the relationship between images and something that happens politically, and there was a whole body of research, particularly in the 1990s, that tried to verify that, both in the case of the Gulf War, but also more broadly. And almost all of that research came to the conclusion that it was almost impossible, with very few exceptions, to identify a causal effect. It was much more complicated than images causing politics, and certainly if you wanted to sort of do it in a real kind of social science causality, not as sort of things kind of hang together, but that there's actually something that causes something else. So that also meant that what we started when people like Roland and me and a lot of you who are in this room is that causality limits the research agenda, both in terms of the capacity to explain or understand what's going on, but also that epistemology would tie into a particular way of understanding the question that is itself too narrow. So I think the one thing that the sort of argument that follows from this is what I call sort of counterfactual reasoning. And we hear often, if you read into this literature, that we could not imagine 9/11 without the images of the planes hitting the World Trade Center. So in that sense, to sort of try to think what it would have been like, would it have been, the outpouring of support for the U.S. In the first month after 9/11 and so on. So I think what this raises, what this creates is a research that's focused on what's called conditions of possibility, Connolly back from the early 1990s. And so on, but it also raises questions about larger societal shifts. what happens when images become so pervasive that constitution of global events happen through images. Or the other way around, if we're taking the counterfactual visuality seriously, what kind of events do not get to be some that matter in world politics because they're not visualized? So I think in that sense, it creates a research agenda. It's part of what we need to attend to, but it also has limitations. First, because not all visual cases will fall into this category, where we can make that counterfactual claim in the way that we can around 9/11. And also because I think, and by we I mean both myself, but also other people who were at the workshop yesterday, that we also do want to say something more specific, I think, than just, quote unquote, as important as that is, the conditions of possibility argument. So this leads me to the second way that I think that images enter, and Roland was already talking about the category of images that we talk about as iconic images. Those that have a distribution, that are recognized, and that are emotionally responded to, if you take one of the standard definitions from the work of Harriman and Friis. And here we think we can talk about iconic causality, and causality is deliberately put in question marks, not just because I find it weird to talk about causality in a way where I would actually claim that that's what I'm studying, but also because I think it's actually accurate both in terms of the empirics and the analytical epistemological claims that are made here. So if we take two examples, Napalm Girl, that was a photograph that changed the American public support for the Vietnam War and therefore was significant in terms of creating was significant in terms of leading the U.S. eventually to pull out of Vietnam. Or recently, the photograph of Alan Kurdi, and here you can see it's not that Roland and I coordinated beforehand, to see that there is such a thing as listening to each other and replicability and stuff like that. But you know that Kurdi, there've been lots of images of the European or the Mediterranean refugee crisis, but the photograph of Alan Kurdi changed Western policies towards something that was more humanitarian, but also arguably in the spring of 2016, the agreement between Turkey and the European Union that effectively stopped migration across that part of the Mediterranean. So here the argument is that there are actually some images, not all that many, but there are some images, the iconic ones, that have an impact on policy. I think this is an argument about causality in quotation marks. First, because it's very hard then, if we're to kind of do the real causal argument, to say that if there's a causal effect, then we should also be able to say what kind of images would become icons, and therefore also that they would have that, if we can say that, we can say which images would actually get to matter. And I think there's not an automatic effect. Alan Kurdi was not the first photograph of a dead child that had drowned in the Mediterranean. So, and if you take Napalm Girl, it was not that there was a change from one day to the other. So there's not an automatic effect. Right? There's a response and reaction to that, but it's also the constitution of icons as icons, and Megan was talking about that in her presentation yesterday as well. So what we'll be looking at here is images that enter into discussions, debates, negotiations over policy and get constituted in a way where, if you like, the status of the image and the political effect gets co-constituted in complicated and intricate ways. This might be bad in the sense that we can't have the causality, which we in some ways already knew from the CNN effect, but it also has the advantage, I think, for us in this room who are political scientists, that it foregrounds the role of agency in politics. That there's not an automatic image effect where we can just look at what is that kind of image and this is the policy conclusion it's going to have. So it means that it foregrounds agency in politics, and I think that are the kind of questions that we're good at asking and addressing. The third body of literature, the third approach that also came up yesterday, is to look to work in political psychology and political communication that go into a laboratory setting or use surveys, experiments through surveys, to try to find out what are the effect of particular kind of images on, for example, the willingness to donate. So there's quite a substantial literature here of what's called the identifiable victim effect, where political psychologists have shown that the smaller the number of humans in a photo, the more likely that those who watch the images will donate. This can play an important role, for example, in generating not hypotheses, but assumptions that you can then take, for example, to quantitative content analysis, where you would code a material to see, which Roland and Emma and David Campbell here has also been involved in, and say, if you have a material where you have very little identifiable victims, then you will also be more conducive to have a politics that's not humanitarian, or politics of fear. I think one of the challenges, and we talked about that yesterday as well, is that you're taking, with this experimental literature, you're taking experiments that are drawing, looking at individual effects, then we have to connect those to politics. So we have to move from the individual to saying something about the collective responses to images. And it also, then I think, becomes something when this enters into both international politics, but also when we talk about it in our field, that there's a second order reflexivity. Right? The identifiable victim effect, even if it's not called that, will also be known to NGOs and to governments and to those who engage with images, which means that it doesn't just work, quote unquote, on individuals as if there's no reflexivity around this. Put differently, if there was a very simple set of experimental causal laws that could be uncovered, I think people with a lot more money than we have would have found those out, and they would be putting out images to get those responses. So this means, again, that I think both in terms of epistemology and how we think about these experimental results, is that we have to take them and move them from a train of what we're looking at effects. This is what happens in the psychological experiments. That's the effect that it gets, and therefore we can take that effect, and this is the politics that follow from it. To shift that from a causal effect to one of potentiality. Right? That there's a potentiality about, for example, images that show individual victims, but it's not automatic. There's a second order reflexivity, and again, there's an agency in politics and a negotiation that go around that. So I think here, my argument is, I think this is an important body of literature, and it tells us something about how images matter. But I think we need to situate it as one of potentiality rather than causal effect, and to make it something that's also part of the political and policy negotiation. Last one. This is the one that comes out, which is perhaps more specific, and some of you in this room will be more familiar with this than others. But this, if we look into the field of international relations scholarship, a lot of the work that's been done on images have come out of a tradition that's looked at very broadly put, the politics of representation. Right, so here the argument is that the representation of identity, the narratives, the stories that are made about phenomena in international relations are significant in terms of delineating a policy terrain upon which more specific policies can be suggested. So, for example, in my earlier work, decades ago, I looked at the Western policies on the Bosnian War and used that to trace out the way in which diverging representations of the war as either a genocide or a Balkan war constituted very different identities for those who were involved in the war, but also for the West who was going to respond or not to that war, and then also the more specific policies that would follow from that. So I think when we move from the textual discourses to the visual, then that raises questions that are both empirical in terms of, is there a collaboration between the textual discourse and the visual? Is it such that Gillian Rose, who's written probably the most famous visual methodology handbook, where she talked about in visual discourse analysis, the way that the textual discourse and spoken discourse about the Victorian prostitute also was evident in a visual discourse that depicted prostitutes in this period. But I think it also raises the question that it can be a disjuncture or limits, okay? That the visual discourse does actually not simply echo the textual discourse that is in place. That can be, I think, because it's simply empirically saying that we can't find those representations, but I think also something theoretically here that is more serious at play, that the way in which that we constitute representations, the narratives that we can put into speech and writing, are some where we can talk about genocide and the Balkans, but those are not necessarily representations that can be easily depicted. Okay? What does a genocide look like, right? Okay, there might be some symbols, there might be some iconic images that have come to be associated with that. Well, we cannot in the same way, so we can say this is a genocide or this is the Balkans. point to something that visually has the same, same kind of certainty in terms of depicting what's represented. So I think that this actually sort of opens up, I think, both theoretically, that we need to keep the disjuncture between the textual and the visual open. But also I think, and this is the note I'm going to conclude on, that there's actually also a theoretical need to, I think, work much more thoroughly than we may have done already on what a visual discourse actually is. Is it something that actually is in need of theorizing to get at the specificity through which, let's say, the visual story gets put together, and then how that's different from the way in which we talk about phenomena in world politics and how they matter. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you to Simone and Roland for organising this afternoon, and also to you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon, and as Roland said, in the term break. It's wonderful to see you all. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hutchison, and I'm a research fellow, as Tim said, in Pulses here at UQ. For those of you who do know me, probably what I'm going to talk about today is going to come as no big surprise. So I'd like to talk about one aspect of why and how images can matter politically. And this is essentially the fact that images provide a lens through not only which we see, but a lens through which we feel. Images matter because, as everyone's already underlined, images matter because they're deeply emotional. If you think for a moment about the examples Roland and Simone and Lene have just mentioned, most of them are intensely traumatic and shocking. The images of Alan Kurdi, 9/11, Abu Ghraib, images from the Islamic State, and I threw this in for a joke, even of Donald Trump for that matter. They're all intensely traumatic and emotional. For many of you, the emotional nature of images probably seems commonsensical. And of course, it's always been this way for me. Images communicate and convey emotions. They depict victims and survivors in visible states of emotional distress. And they're interpreted through emotions. So seeing images enables audiences to enact particular feelings, whether it's anguish, despair, shock, anger, and so on. But traditionally in political science, both images and emotions have been neglected. And as Tim mentioned in his introduction, emotions in particular were best thought left out of political analysis and policy. In the past 10 to 15 years, however, there's been a growing field that shows how emotions are pivotal and pervasive in politics, and that this is the case at all levels. So I would like to take my time to suggest one way we can think about the links between images and emotions, and what this means for the political significance and impact of images. I, and much of my work, suggest that as representations of reality, images can have what I call a particular type of emotional pull. So this is to say that images can resonate and attain emotional meanings and significance in ways that, in collective and politically influential ways. So this kind of cuts across also what Lene was talking about icons and potentiality. So for me, an image becomes an icon precisely because of the type of emotional pull it attains. And this emotional pull is inherently social. So how we feel about images is really about, it has everything to do with how our emotions have been socially and culturally constituted. One obvious recent example, as I think everyone's mentioned, is that of Alan Kurdi. Even though the change after this image was temporary, The image of Alan prompted several countries to rethink their humanitarian intake policies. And I didn't want to show, I don't like to show the image of Alan Kurdi, but here's a similar image of Amran Darknish that was perhaps not as influential but equally powerful in terms of its perhaps iconic capacity. So I'd like to suggest in particular that images can, through the emotions that are solicited and enacted in audiences, work to facilitate two different types, very different types of political outcomes. And my research has looked at both of these scenarios. The first is that images can resonate and activate emotions and emotional meanings that essentially reinstate existing political orders. So by this I mean ways of thinking, perceiving of key dilemmas, and the types of policy options that pursue. So this is again the types of potentiality that Lene was talking about. We often see this type of response after forms of political crisis and violence, such as terrorism. This was the case, as my research has shown, after the 2002 Bali bombing. And some of you who, I know there are some younger people in the audience, they might not have been old enough to have seen these, but this is, so these are a couple of front page photographs that were shown in 2002 after the Bali bombing in Kuta. A similar situation happened after September 11. In these cases, we see images tapping into prevailing social collective forms of emotion that function to reinstate the primacy of the state, and in turn the status quo, the political status quo. The second situation, in contrast, is that images can appeal to emotions in ways that shift and transform existing political orders and configurations. These transformative potentials of images might be less apparent or elusive, but they can be powerful. I've studied these effects in cases of humanitarian catastrophe, such as after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. And in these cases, we see images of distress, and I don't think this is not going to work. This was a very prominent front page of the New York Times, which actually garnered a degree of public outcry. But in these situations, we see images of distress, suffering, and hardship appealing to forms of emotion that make people feel in ways that extend their spheres of care and responsibility. So just in sum, the key point I'd like to make is that images, through the emotions and the kind of emotional pull they can have, hold significant political potentials. The emotional nature of images can help to make some political perceptions and options and policies more possible than others, and they can also, in the same way, foreclose political possibilities and potentialities. But I think it's in this way, because of the powerful emotional pull images can have, that they deserve much further scrutiny in political analysis.
Thank you again to Simone and Roland for a wonderful workshop. Thank you to everyone who attended. And you know, we had such a great discussion yesterday, and it's wonderful to be back at UQ. Today I'm going to just talk a little bit about war images and what we can learn from studying war images. I am really interested in war myth and how images are used to sustain war myth and the importance of myth in allowing war to continue to be perpetuated. But when we think about war images, I'm going to make 3 points. First is that, and it sort of echoes some of the points that Lene was making, that when it comes to evidence, that there's a lot of counterintuitive facts around war images. The second is that soldier-generated images, or amateur images that soldiers take with their phones or cameras during war, I think changes how war is viewed by the public.
And third, just the general argument that war images are essential to sustaining war myths. So when I'm talking today, I'm going to focus primarily on the US military, and when I'm talking about war images, I'm mostly talking about the public consumption of images that portray the Iraq or Afghanistan wars, but certainly there are broader understandings of war images. So as has already been indicated, it's safe to say that there's general consensus that images matter. And I think especially when we think about war images, we assume that war images matter a lot politically. And that regardless of how much they matter and these questions about why they matter and how do we measure that, there seems to be no disagreement that war images matter. We assume that having an image of an event in war does something different than not having an image of something in war. But in terms of the measured impacts of war images, there's actually counterintuitive facts, and there is quite a lot of research. So Lene and others have pointed to some problems with the CNN effect, but two things we assume about war images tend to be that when we see images, for example, of casualties, that public support for war goes down. That's one of the sort of political impacts that can be measured and that we assume, I think actually primarily because when we see images of dead bodies, we feel something and we assume that there is an extended impact. But a lot of research shows that that's not true. So there's been some research done. One study in particular looked at whether people, the public, surveyed people who had seen images after U.S. service members were killed in Somalia and in Mogadishu, and found that people who had seen images of that versus people who had not seen images of the dead soldiers actually had no impact on support for that mission or general understanding of the mission. Also, there's a sort of assumed body bag impact. And the reason I started looking into that, there's sort of an implied assumption that women being brought home from war, female soldiers, have a different impact on the public than male soldiers. But in fact, the body bag effect is not there, either for women or for men. There's research that shows that images of body bags have little impact in terms of public support. So this is just one measure of impact, but it's certainly to me sort of counterintuitive. So I think we certainly, the CNN effect, we sort of unpacked that, but I also think we have to sort of be sure to interrogate and to look at the evidence around what kinds of impacts. So come back. The second general point I wanted to make, or just to sort of highlight, is around soldier-generated images. Because I think this is a very interesting sort of development. And one of the interesting things about soldier-generated images is that they tend to sort of flow through to the public in a very common way, in that these are images that tend to be taken by soldiers and circulated internally in internal communities, either by USB keys or through shared private sites. Obvious examples are Abu Ghraib, but there's a more recent example of Marines United, where Marines had this private Facebook group where they shared revenge porn, it's called, or really non-consented images of women. What's interesting to me about these images is that they're shared consensually, and they seem to be a source of camaraderie and celebration before they make it to the public and create a scandal for the public. So the public views them differently than the internal community that they were intended for, and I think that's quite interesting. So as I've been exploring soldier-generated images, it made me think, in terms of the broader question I think it begs, is the importance of context. So what is it about those images that allows soldiers to see them as a source of camaraderie? And what is it about those images that makes us see them as a source of scandal? So I'm going to show you a couple of images, some of which are unpleasant, such as the nature of some war images, just to give you a sense of what it means, I think, to put images in context. So if we think of some common images of camaraderie and hazing, and certainly I'm not comparing hazing to torture at Abu Ghraib, but also just to think about how to put images into what I would think of as a visual vernacular. So how does this change how we see images? How might it help us to understand how soldiers see images? Okay, so the last point I wanted to make was that similar, it's sort of related to the CNN effect. I think we assume that war images tell us a lot about the war. And as I mentioned yesterday in my presentation, there's actually quite a lot of war images that, what I said yesterday, don't tell us much. So here's some images that sort of tell a story, tell us something we know. It's very difficult to sort of argue with some of the aspects of these images. But then if we look at a lot of iconic war images, such as this, they sort of hint at some aspects, but they don't tell us very much about war. I think it's very interesting to look at the relationship of war and myth, and look at how these images not only don't tell us much, but sort of provide a blank slate through which we can convey whatever we want or what we need to about war. And in that sense, I think war images can be very important in sustaining and reinforcing myth. So in conclusion, really, I just wanted to say that I think it's important to sort of fully let go of the CNN effect and to stop referencing it in general terms and in a very concrete way, to think about visual context, and to recognize the role of images in sustaining war.
You don't have any slides?
All right, last and least. 3 confessions. First of all, unlike everybody else, I have no pictures. Secondly, what I'm going to talk about today is very, very speculative in my own mind. And thirdly, it is rather abstract. I'll see if I can make it concrete. So please bear with me on all of those. I'm afraid I'm all you have to look at. I want to argue that when it comes to images, one of the things that we need to think about very, very clearly is the way in which it problematizes not simply the social position of the viewer, that is, of the people we are studying, but also the social position of ourselves as analysts. In this way, I want to argue we have to be not simply self-reflective in the way that we're all taught in our god-awful research training courses, right, that we have to do about being reflexive about what we do, but actually in terms of the social location of the very peculiar thing called a modern intellectual or academic, and its relationship to other forms of viewing. I want to argue that we, if we are not careful, are at risk of imposing a set of categories that systematically allow us not to understand or disallow our understanding that which we seek to understand. Okay, if I can make good on that. We are all, I believe, children, everyone in this room, like it or not, myself included, children of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant had no real children, but he had lots of progeny, and we are some of them. And I think we've seen how, in what we've just talked about in incredibly compelling and sophisticated terms. For Kant, we had 3 questions: the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right? Think about each of those in relation to images. Do images help propagate the good? Is Alan Kurdi an emotional trigger towards cosmopolitan empathy? Is a picture of an enemy exactly the opposite? It's a category of the good. The true, the issues that Lene talked about with extraordinary rigor, I think. How do we separate out the truth of an image? What is the relationship between an image and truth? All of the questions of representation that have dominated political science in this analysis for at least 20 years. Finally, the beautiful. Kant's wonderful final critique, third critique, on aesthetics, where he argues that the key to the beautiful is that unlike the good, which we can know as moral duty, unlike the true, which we can know as science, aesthetics can only cause us to reflect upon the beautiful and to engage in an endless discussion with each other around what it is that is beautiful. This, other people have tried to politicize as being the essential democratic ethos, the aesthetic ethos of modern democracy, that there is no truth, and that's what it is to be a democracy. It is a constant dialogue around the truth. In other words, at one level, modern conceptions of democracy are deeply aesthetic. And they emerge precisely out of this trilogy, the good, the true, and crucially, the beautiful. There is a different way of thinking about this tradition. And it's this one that I want to argue is in fact politically ascendant at this time. I argue that the modern academy is so attached to the Kantian conception of aesthetic politics, to the idea of unknowability, of difference, of plurality, of indecidability, that we are almost systematically incapable of comprehending the most powerful aesthetic politics of our times. And those are aesthetic politics that precisely reject this form of pluralism. They are those that take their cue from the idea that Kant begins with, that we cannot know the truth of the world, that we can only construct it in various ways. And rather than seeing that as plurality, they see it as a challenge. A challenge not to embrace that plurality, but in fact to create commonality and solidarity against it. This is a tradition that one finds philosophically most interestingly in Martin Heidegger, where he characterizes it what he calls anxiety. Thus, the fact that we can't know the truth makes us anxious. Now, in much of modern political science, and especially in sort of vaguely social constructivist, nice progressive, postmodernist, all the rest of that, anyone who cannot grasp this undecidability is effectively maladapted, right? This is how we view the rest of the world. We are those of us who understand the fundamental plurality and relativity of the world, and there are somehow epistemic or political primitives who don't. That, I want to argue, is our conceit. It is our socially located conceit. Our opponents, if one wants to adopt that position, understand this just as well as we do. And their argument is that what you need to do is construct a unity as a challenge in the face of that. This, I want to argue, is exactly what is happening in the ascendant conservative movements around the world. It is not a hearkening back to tradition. It is not, in these pathetic analyses of modern populism, which we never actually define, some kind of recidivism of left behind, right? Once again, it's the primitive. What did Hillary call them? The desperate and the deplorables, right? To which, of course, most of us agreed and lost the election. What, in fact, they do is seek to generate a new aesthetic whole. And in part, contemporary conservatism is based around exactly this re-aestheticization in an older, almost pre-modern sense of politics. It is a self-conscious re-mythologization of politics. And it is one that is carried out strategically, self-consciously, and as a political program in which some of its targets are exactly those of us in this room. We are the targets of it precisely because we are identified as the problem, not the solution. I'll give you two examples, both of them from UK politics. I spent a month in the UK before happily coming to Australia. Theresa May just called the election, most famous comment on the problem with contemporary Britain. You cannot have a country built on citizens of nowhere. Michael Gove, one of her opponents, but now supporters in the Conservative leadership, argued the people have had enough of experts. Look around, and that's what you see. The idea being that there is a re-mythologized people that can be mobilized precisely against an aesthetic politics that sees that as difference and relativity. The problem for us is that we cannot assume that this emerges out of an intellectual position that does not understand the fundamental truths that we do. The problem may be that it understands them better than we do. Better in the sense that it defines understanding as political success. And it, as much as we hate to admit it, is winning. Thus, I think the aesthetic politics of contemporary politics is as much found in Donald Trump's red baseball cap as in anything else. The red baseball cap tells us almost everything we need to know. And it's something that we need to overcome how we think we know in order to know. And that, I think, is one of the things that aesthetics and an aesthetic agenda can provide for us in politics. And it's an absolute necessity if one is going to try to engage with this very, very powerful counter-aesthetic movement in contemporary politics. That's me.
So we now all know where the break my professor got his eulogetic comments from. Thanks for that, Michael, and to all the panelists. That was really, really terrific. So we've got about 45 minutes for, I think we're stopping at 5, is that right, Roland? So there's a good amount of time, I think, for people to make points, raise questions. I think we can keep it in a fairly sort of relaxed way. It'd be quite helpful, I think, for some of the panelists in particular, if you could identify yourself before you make your comment or question. So let's throw it open to you guys. Who'd like to kick us off? You can aim a comment at everybody or someone in particular. Yeah.
Thanks. Again, I really enjoyed the discussions yesterday and I very much enjoyed those presentations today. But sort of here's a comment, you can tell me that I'm all sort of wrong, but I was really struck by the discussion yesterday and today that when we're talking about how images matter in world politics, we gravitate towards the iconic. We've had a lot of discussion about what an iconic image is, what the effect of an iconic image is, or the shocking or the scandalous. And I was thinking, and it's partly from some of the teaching I've been doing recently, is that the images that also have a great deal of impact are fleeting. They're the things that we saturated with images. We see them and we don't see them. They go past us and they communicate, they signal so much. In teaching lately, I've been showing my students pictures of handshakes, political encounters, showing them particularly contrasting of like good old Donald Trump meeting different leaders. And the body language we see in those sort of images. And those images, they're there and they're gone, but actually we're absorbing a great deal of information within that. And also I'm interested in the images that are cumulative images cumulative images of particular genres of people or events or things like that that become banal, that don't necessarily shock us or strike anything, but are full, they're very rich in terms of the text that they communicate to us. And of course we're very familiar, when we're talking about IM30, the thing about that was we had seen so many images that didn't shock us. And so I'm interested in those of you who are studying visual politics about how we think about the fleeting and the banal in our studies of images and visual politics and what they do.
That's a really good question. Yeah, why don't you another and then you throw it over.
Shahamiri, also from Pulses, getting a question to the panel. You know, one of my favorite bands from 1988, Jane's Addiction, had a song and an album called Nothing Shocking. And even back then, talking about the 80s, already I guess cable, satellite television was around, and the argument that they made, if you want to call it that, was that we saturate all these images, nothing shocks us anymore. And so that follows on a little bit from the point that Jacinta was making. How does something go from shocking to banal, and how do we get desensitized? That's something that you thought about as well in the panel discussion. Thanks.
Good. So, Lene, do you want to go with that?
Yeah, I mean, Jacinta, you're absolutely right about what's been the primary concern. Is it okay if I sit, or should I stand up? That the primary focus in visual international relations so far has been on iconic images and striking images more broadly. And I think for good reasons, which has to do with the way in which that the visual turn has entered into IR, which has by and large been through post-structuralist and security, post-structuralist IR in general, and particularly those part of post-structuralism that have been concerned with security discourses. So it's a lot easier to theorize the iconic image because there's text about it. Right? So in that sense, you don't actually have to do the full move from the textual discourse to the visual discourse, where there's no anchoring of the visual discourse, because you have all of the contestations, in some cases like the Muhammad cartoons, which was my first sort of way into looking at images, or all of the text about what the Kurdi image, what that says. So I think that in other words, the disciplinary sociological reasons that explain why that has been the focus. And also that the sort of so both the post-structuralist in terms of the status of discourse and that it's come in, I think, largely through the concern with security, and not to say that there isn't anything about the banal or what Jeff Huysman's called little security nothings and so on, but there's also gravitation to those that are the striking, the dramatic, the shocking, if you like. So I think that that's an explanation. I think that it's also, I mean, for my own work, it's you start with the easy cases, right? You start with the ones that you're best equipped. When you expand your research agenda, you start with that, which is what you feel most equipped to make that transition into. So I think also in that sense, there's no one, I think, visual agenda in international relations or world politics. Let me put it differently, so the jet lag start to talk here. The fact that has been the concern so far should not stop other people from expanding that research agenda to look at the fleeting, the mundane, the banal, and so on and so forth. I think that there are people who work in diplomacy, Rebecca Adlenissen, who's also part of the project in Copenhagen, who's working on more of the everyday practices of diplomacy, that intersects with that. I think if I could just say comment on the shocking, I mean, maybe the way, because my way into looking at images have been through politics of representation, post-structuralist theory, and so on and so forth. I'm less interested in the individual effect of the image. So in that sense, whether it shocks us or not is less important to me than the discourse about whether they shock or not. So if you take Kurdi, which we've done some research on in the project in Copenhagen as well, one of the things that's characteristic about that, it is a very emotional discourse. You had David Cameron talking about how he's moved as a father and on. Whether he's actually shocked or not, maybe we can do that sort of that individual level analysis is less important, I think, to the research agenda that I'm involved in than the discourse about the images. And if we look to that, I don't think it's the fact that nothing shocks us anymore. I mean that's just actually empirically not true if we're looking at the discourses about both Kurdi but also Denmark, that you're showing this, the other Syrian boy. So, yeah.
Does anyone else want to comment on either of those two questions? Roland?
I can say a couple of words, just that sort of reinforcing it in some sense. To me, this sort of notion that, images happen at the spectacular, the mundane. That's precisely why we need multiple methods. They happen at so many different levels, and it, I think, leads to a certain sort of modesty in some sense that Michael was saying. Like we got to be aware where we stand, what we can do, but also be modest enough to say other people might be able to look at it that way and collaborate and look at it, including the issue of getting desensitized. I mean, there's massive debates in the literature. On the one hand, you have people arguing that if certain crises aren't visualized, there's no political action. Rwanda, like there were no images, therefore we didn't have that immediate response that we get when a crisis is visualized. On the other hand, one of the most famous arguments in the literature is Susan Möller's compassion fatigue argument. That, if we get confronted with too many images of suffering, we sort of turn off. And one of the things we wanted to do with our psychologist colleagues is to actually test that. Look at what happens when people get confronted with 5 images of suffering, 10, 15, 20, whether that has an effect. But again, I think ultimately, and maybe that feeds into Michael's sort of argument, my thing is like, we can't have the ultimate truth on what happens to images. We can have a position, but I think we have to have the modesty to be tolerant that there's multiple perspectives and different ways of looking at them. And that's sort of, to me, an epistemological position. But I also understand the political position that that would lead to certain types of anxieties that people want to know the truth about images. They don't want to know what it happens. But as a scholar, I can't help noticing that I've got enough modesty to know I'm never going to be able at that truth. And that's not a political position; it's an epistemological position.
I just want to say I can say a couple of words in kind of in reverse, I think, to Shaha and Cindy. First of all, I just wanted to say I actually completely disagree with the idea that we're becoming more desensitized to images. I actually think, and see, I've always studied images through emotion, so for me they're inseparable. And for me, it's really that particular emotional responses and in turn social and political responses to images have become normalized in particular contexts. So how we feel when we see images of famine is going to be, and whether we feel dismay or some may feel apathy, some may feel, I think it's all very culturally and socially contingent, and it's not that I don't think that it's that we're desensitized, it's just that particular responses have become normalized, and sometimes that's unfortunate, and in turn I think the shocking and banal, I wrote down here that we're talking about the focus on shocking images and iconic images, but there's also a lot of work, mostly more now in visual communication studies, who actually look at the construction of visual narratives, and this is kind of, I think, it works together with the way in which particular responses have become normalized because particular visual narratives become more predominant, and through exactly that, through the fleeting images, through the accumulation of images, and that's how they sort of end up having impact. It's sort of not just, I don't think it's just about iconic images, it is about the accumulation of images over time and how they produce particular social meanings, predominant social meanings, and in turn expectations. So that's, so I think you were spot on,
Yes, well, it actually follows really nice from what Emma was just saying, because I really agree. I don't think images have lost their shock value. But to the question of how an image goes from being banal to being shocking, I think there are two things that are really important, and one thing is visibility. So it needs to be seen for it to have a reaction, but another thing that's really important is the cultural context. So what an image to be shocking in one public sphere, it really depends on the cultural context, and
And that's where I think IR comes in and can really make a big contribution, because what we see right now is that images have gained a larger circulation, so so particular images circulate into contexts they haven't been in before, and therefore we see shock reactions that are culturally situated, and that are really, really interesting politically, because like Lene has done a lot of work on the Mohammed Khatun crisis, how something that's just not shocking in a Danish context could be completely shocking somewhere else. And I think IR actually has a really big job in terms of capturing these dynamics. So that would be my response.
Good.
Well, thanks everyone again for another round after a spectacular workshop yesterday. I've had the privilege to be part of that yesterday and have read all your work. We had to read for the workshop. And one of the questions I would like to throw at you is to give us a sense of which thinker, which text, which book, maybe which image it actually is that you could point out that influenced your own research on these topics more strongly. Like which one would you point towards on the different topics you've been talking about that you would point towards that has really opened your eyes or influenced your thinking on your own research topics?
Since you had the privilege of going last and writing your talk while listening to the others, I think you have to answer that now first.
I'm not sure that I can, sir. I'm honestly not sure that I can. How's that for an answer?
But it does touch upon a dilemma I'm having about what are the boundaries and limits of the image. We're sort of taking for granted what an image is here, and of course, we've seen obvious examples, but of course, Wittgenstein and many other philosophers will tell us that we create images from a variety of different, from myths, memories, and so on, and we, from an early learning process, it's how you actually learn by turning words into images. So to what extent? For example, Michael, when you were talking about building children of Kant, you were portraying quite a large conceptual landscape of a certain kind of image of rational thought, of a certain European tradition. And for me, that created quite a strong picture about what you're talking about. And you had the picture of the red cap symbolizing a reactionary conservatism or whatever. So, but in a sense, the images that you were constructing were not reducible really to a single artifice or an objectified sort of realm. They were textual as well as being symbolic.
Yeah. I mean, let me change it slightly, so let me give you a scarring episode in my intellectual life. How's that instead? Okay. It's an actual practical
I'm curious
experience.
to hear what
Not as
it's
bad as that
called.
now.
Well, no, and it was a scarring experience that I suspect Tim may not have scarred him, but it certainly scarred me, but he may well have been there. It was when we were both in Aberystwyth. And a quite senior and well-known scholar came to give a talk to our department on some of these related themes. I won't name the person of the talk, but ended the talk by saying, in all seriousness, this is on the west coast of Wales, don't forget, right? In all seriousness, that if we wanted to understand world politics, the best thing that we and our students could do was get on a train, go down to London, and see a painting that was on display down there. Now I ask myself, I can think about that in intellectual terms. What are the conditions of the possibility, to use Lene's language from earlier, and Kant's language, of a person making a statement like that? In other words, not what is its analytic status, what is its social location? And what does that tell us about the limits that we have, predetermined limits, in thinking about aesthetics? Because it seems to me that one of the problems that we have as academics is that we actually have a socially located habitus, quasi-conscious, through which we approach images, through which we categorize what matters and what doesn't, and through which we categorize how others categorize, right? And it's that level of reflexivity that I think we've got to grab hold of. Because if not, then I think we unconsciously risk imposing a certain set of social categories upon a set of phenomena that tell us more about us than tell us about the phenomena. Favorite line on this, if I can give you one, my argument would be from Pierre Bourdieu, right? That nothing categorizes a person more than the way they categorize. Right? I think that should be emblazoned on the wall of every politics department in the world, because it applies to us, not only to the objects of the actors that we're looking at.
Would you like to, anyone else like to respond? All of you? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, keep rolling. Megan, you didn't respond.
Oh, well, yeah, maybe it's a similar moment, I guess, and it might tell you a little bit about our project as well. Or I think it was the first workshop we had, so for the Images project that's based at the University of Copenhagen. One of the Johan Spanner was working as a research assistant and is now part of the project as a master's student, and he also happened to be a war photographer for the New York Times in Iraq for 7 years. And so I guess this moment sort of shaped how I think about war images. So before this workshop, I'd spent 4 months in Sierra Leone, when the war was sort of just over. So it's not to say that I'd never seen anything terrible. And that's not about, as we were talking last night, getting into some contest about who's seen more gruesome pictures. But I thought I, had fairly tough skin. But Johan gave us this sort of presentation, I guess, showing us some of the images that he had taken in Iraq, and showing us the ones that were published and some of the ones that sort of he thought should have been published and some of the ones that didn't get published. And we had a general kind of conversation about the process through which images come to be seen by us, and the images he thought were most relevant. And also, inevitably, we were experiencing, and I think we were sort of visualizing him in Iraq taking these photos, right? And he was like, he's very, if you haven't met him maybe, is very humble, stoic, quite unemotional during the presentation. And we didn't really know him that well. Like, this was sort of when we were all getting to know each other. And we're in this little room, and it was like, none of us talked about it for quite a while, I think, until some drinks were had. So it was this really intensely emotional experience where you have to sort of consume a lot of images, but also really think serious about, I guess, affect. So the point I would make is, I think we keep talking about, so this is sort of like a teaching moment. I don't want to sound like an instructor moment here, but I think we keep talking about affect and effect like as if they're together. And I'm not sure. I think that we know from our own experience that images cause affect. That's pretty, from our own experience, we feel that to be true. We don't know, different images cause different kinds of affect. We've talked about this. But whether that causes any effect in terms of our behavior changes, I think is something we can't assume. And that evidence, we can measure effect, right? We can't measure how different people respond to images. We can all assume that we're shocked by bodies. But in terms of effect, in terms of like what that makes us do, that's quite measurable. And there's not a lot of evidence to show that affect changes effect. And so those are the two things, I guess, that shaping moment in terms of me thinking about emotion, but also me being a little bit skeptical that emotion means much politically. And that's a difficult thing to say, because I think we all assume like horrible images change our behavior, but the evidence is actually not so much there.
Lene, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the image that made me start on the work on images that then led to this larger project was the Muhammad cartoons. It was, having worked on discourses and knowing that I needed to do something on images for quite a while. When the Muhammad cartoon crisis happened, and being able to read Danish, be part of it from the beginning, and so on and so forth. So that was a very clear springboard into this. But I think it was also significant in two additional ways. One was that as I started to give presentations about the cartoons in England, in the UK, and in the US, various places in Europe, I was at first really surprised about the emotional responses I would get from the audience. Right? And if we think, and these are academic audiences, and we think this would be a critical case, right? Because the academic discourse is about not being emotionally involved, right? So and it would be it would range both from how can you show these cartoons and you should be making a stance on that they shouldn't have happened and so on, but then also in other settings I was sort of called upon to make a stance for free speech and should they have been published or not and so on and so forth. But I was like, well, I'm just trying to like deconstruct what's been going on. So that actually that the fact, in speaking of emotional responses and so on and so forth, that something that wasn't quote unquote not even a photographic description, right? So in principle it wasn't like Johann's pictures, very small body parts that were being lying on a street in Iraq, but something that was a drawing, that would generate those kind of responses even in an academic setting. So that for me was one important kind of sort of formative experience that I would take away from this. And so to link to that, in terms of text, years later, when the book by, amongst the Wendy Brown and Judith Butler came out, that also dealt with the cartoon crisis, called Critique Secular, and the certainty with which that they would talk about the cartoons as insulting and injuring and so on, and rightly so. Judith Butler has been one of the sort of political theory stars in international relations, and I was like, with what certainty can you talk about what these images are and not problematize that at all? And I think it's much more problematic. There's much more politics. There's actually, I think, in their work, a depoliticization of what these images were that I thought that I criticized a little bit in one of the pieces that I've written on this, but was also striking. That from a perspective which is all about the performative and across a range of terrains, then these images were not performative, but had a certainty that I thought was striking. Right? So in that sense, those two, both my own experiences in terms of lecturing about it, but also in terms of the way in which it's been dealt with in academic text, was significant for me to want to do this larger project. Well, thank you for the question. It's nothing like being able to talk about oneself on a Friday afternoon.
Simone, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, for me, I have to mention two pictures because of this relationship between them that kind of defined why they were important. The first is obvious. When I saw the James Foley video and started watching the Islamic State's videos, that obviously had a huge impact on me. But I think where I really understood the significance of this event was when I discovered a different kind of images, namely images of Syrians being subjected to equally brutal acts of violence circulating on the internet, but not getting the same kind of attention as the images of the Islamic State's victims, particularly Westerners. And that was shocking for me, first of all, because I realized how limited my sight is as a Western person. I didn't know this was going on. And it was also shocking because it was, when I tried to write something about this, I discovered it was so much more difficult to write about these particular images compared to the Islamic State, who everybody wanted to hear about. Every time I wanted to say something about the Islamic State, people listened. Every time I tried to say something about these images, no one listened. So it was just discovering that, and that actually goes to what Tim was talking about. What's really the interesting question here? Is it the image as an object itself, or is it broader visual regimes that determines who is seen and who are not seen? And for me, that was formed my perspective on this, because I discovered that it's not just about one image, but about some very larger visual regimes that conditions how we see.
Okay, so I'd like to take a few points, the last round of points, and then we'll go to the. Mike, did you want to come?
Yes, I have an answer for you now.
Oh, okay.
2 books. Either Bourdieu's The Rules of Art or The Field of Cultural Production. And the one reason I'll say that is because one of the things I think Lene said that was really, really interesting is she was shocked by the response that she got when she talked about the cartoons. Knowing that you were speaking to an academic audience, I would have actually expected that response, because our responses are just as structured. In fact, maybe even more structured. Indeed, I think they're almost eminently predictable.
Or even you, Mike.
Even me.
Dan wants to ask.
Thanks, Tim. And I apologise I came in late, so you can defer this till after if you've already covered it. I'm interested in the journalistic side of this, and particularly in Australia at the moment, the recent announcement of basically a bunch of photojournalists being put off by News Corp. This also comes across from the States, where within some of the high kind of circulation papers, it's this classic case of when the Cubs won the World Series. I don't know if some of you saw this. They put side by side the Tribune and all the other papers, one with an iconic image of that kind of 100-something year drought break by the Cubs, and this image that has 4 of the players kind of embracing this incredible assembly, and another one which was just a throwaway front page image. And it's kind of circulated amongst the journalism circles, looking, press photography versus kind of AAP style front page photo. My question is directed at that. With the current economy of photojournalists losing, even in the Australian context, a photojournalist won the Walkley Award, our highest rated journalism award just last year. I was at the award ceremony when he won this for a body of work from Afghanistan. And so it's interesting that while photojournalists are being lauded with these awards, they're also losing their jobs. What effect do you think this is going to have without having these kinds of properly trained photojournalists working, producing these images? What effect will this have on their politics?
Great, go for it.
This is a really important question because I think we're seeing that essentially in Syria right now. Like we're seeing it in the Middle East, we're seeing many conflicts that we don't have a lot of professional journalists operating in these areas anymore. But what we have are people taking up their own cameras and starting to make videos and share it. And we see the big news corporations actually using videos produced by not professional photographers, and that obviously changes the perspective on these conflicts. Like some people, there's this, the liberal kind of, now everything becomes more democratic, we can all show the world, but that's obviously not necessarily what's happening because there's still editors who kind of shape what are chosen and what are not. But it is it's super interesting in terms of the dynamics of this, that we now have some people who might not be trained also in ethical considerations about what we see. So I definitely think that just the whole visual portrayal of conflicts is going to change a lot in the next few years.
Yeah, like Megan was saying, we have Johan Spanner as part of the project, so he would be the right person to answer that. But if I could just say, maybe 2 things following up from what Simone was saying. The question about the strains put upon traditional photojournalism and what that does, I think, is one that is kind of usefully maybe broken down into one about the questions about the quality of the images that one gets, and if we want to make an argument about that the quality of an image, the composition and whether stuff is in the image that shouldn't be in it, how it's framed and so on, which Johan has taught us some about, that if you're a trained photojournalist, you simply take better pictures. And if a better picture has a bigger chance of having, getting to have an emotional impact. So there's something here about the extent to which we'll theorize that logic. If that is the case, then at least it raises those questions about the relationship between the trained, the quality, and the political status of the image. But then there's also, and I think that's those two sort of often don't really get pulled apart. So there's the quality, but then there's also the content. And I think sort of on the argument that that everybody taking pictures with their cell phones and people who are, that you'd get images that you would not get if you were just relying on professional photojournalists, which might be true. Right? But I think, like Megan was saying, Johan and certainly, and I think that goes generally for the works of photojournalists that we've come across, through him, they will take pictures that they know will never be printed in the newsletters that they're working for, but they take them anyways. Right? So it's not that there isn't the content that could have been carried. Right? So I think the question here becomes: do we see actually a change over time in terms of editorial practices that will actually be showing things that they would not have shown 10 years ago? I'm not saying whether it would be made, but at least to me it produces, when we were saying it produces that as an interesting question. And it's not because the content has not been available, but there's something about the relationship between the practitioners the viewers, so that audiences will be able to go online and see things that they would not do, 15 years ago. So there's some interesting things there happening that speaks to what you're saying. I mean, I can just say on a sort of personal note as well. I've worked with Johan on a project on the Venice Biennale, so not very kind of spectacularly dangerous and stuff like that. But I never worked with a professional photojournalist before. And that was actually, if any of you have that chance or have experienced that, I mean, that was actually incredibly interesting in terms of, to get a real sense of that practice, how close you are, to the subjects you're photographing, how you move in space, which is very different from, tourists taking photographs with their cell phones and so on and so forth. So there's also something here about, photojournalistic practices and the way that images are being captured that I think actually is quite interesting.
One quick thing. I think one also has to, if one looks at this in brutally politically strategic terms, one also has to be careful of being nostalgic for the front page photo. In the murky world that I study these days, and these people are not very nice, but of course I would say that, it is memes that matter, okay? So to take Emma's use of an image earlier, the one that you showed of the Syrian child in the helicopter. There is, most of you have probably seen it, a full front facial image on that. Very, very evocative image. The most popular meme that circulated amongst the alt-right community around that was one that came with a banner underneath it which said, and you have to excuse my language here, but it's a direct quote, "This fucking kid is trying to get you into a war." Okay? These are people who understand this. Amongst that genre of the alt-right, the Trump campaign was called the Great Meme War. And they regard themselves as having won it. And for anybody who's interested, they've now turned their attentions very, very strongly and very strategically to trying to help Marine Le Pen win in France. Okay? So it's not simply the images anymore. It's the way you can do, and these people have done way better work than I'll ever do in this. The intertext, image, and then the circulation that really matters.
Excuse me, Tim. It's a photojournalist
I'm
question
sorry,
here.
I'm Shihab. I actually was being practitioner photographer, professional photographer for a long time, and then in academia for the last few years, and I'm working with Griffith for the last 5 years. So having the experience being working as a photojournalist and teaching at the same time, so I think we need to think about the power dominance. Because when we're talking about the image circulation, any type of image, especially photographic images, we need to think about the power dominance in terms of who has the power. So in looking at that, the publisher or the editor has the more power. And the people on the ground, both the photojournalists and the participant or the people we have been photographing has the less power. So they are in the bottom situation. They have the first experience, but they don't have any right to think about which image they're going to publish or which image need to be seen. So it's changing now because of the social media and we all are at the same time photojournalists and publisher because we have the platform, social platform and other platform as IS doing their own. At the same time, we need to think about who portraying whom. So me, if I am coming from a Western background, from one Western newspaper, for instance, Times or Der Spiegel or any other newspaper going to a majority world country or Syria or anywhere, what we actually photographing is pre-prescribed most of the time. And we're going to the hotel, we know we're going to the filling station or to the war zone, we're actually going and everyone kind of hunting the photos we after. Whereas the other people, we need to think about what's happening if the photographer or the photographs coming from the people, and obviously the perspective is going to be changed. At the same time, I do have questions when we're talking about the language and the aesthetics and better or good images, because we always think that we, as an academician, we know everything. But language never comes like that. I come to your point, sir. Who we are saying that I'm right. So we need to think a little bit beyond and think everything quite saying the certain. We need to question ourselves. Am I talking this is right, or this is beautiful? Is it right? Or I'm talking this is a shocking image. That could not be any more shocking image. If you look at in terms of definition of shock, it's very different in Bangladesh, where I came from, and it's very different in Australia. So we need to also talk about all these points and argue on that before we putting a judgment on anything, especially in visual language.
Which is an interesting argument for plurality.
Do you want to handle that one first?
No, I couldn't agree more with everything you said.
Furious agreement, I think, but thank you for your comment.
Yes, my
See, before, since there was furious agreement, I'm going to sound a note of the students here. Because I felt in some of the responses to Dan's question about photojournalism, there was a bit of a blurring of affect and effect, because if it matters, if the quality of the picture matters and the ownership matters, and whether it's done by a professional, whether it's done by an amateur and so on, you know, if it's a regime of affect and not effect, then essentially we've got to pull back from making big claims about how changes in the industry are going to change the political context. Just a thought. Maybe, I don't know whether anyone wants to respond to that. Roland, do you want to?
Just a couple of sort of things to weave some things together. Coming back in some sense to the remark that you made, Tim, about the complexity of images and Simone's response. I think it's very important that when we look at visual politics, not just at two-dimensional images, and a lot of this discussion has been around that, has been around photographs, film, how they circulate, what they're done, but I think we also have to look at three-dimensional visual artifacts. I mean, the world around us is visual in every single way, not just images. You know, we have National Monument, Federica down there, she's going to Canberra in a couple of days to study military parades and museums. All that shapes us just as much as the images that circulate. And there's the similarities and differences, but to understand the power of the visual, I think we really have to look at the visual field around us. And I think one person that comes back to this episode point, in collaboration with Sally, that I always find is very useful to look beyond causal models of the social science sort of context, is Jacques Rancière and this sort of notion of the distribution of the sensible, which goes back to Conley's point of conditions of possibility. When he says, in essence, to understand the power of images, we have to just look at images, not just images two-dimensional, but the visual world around it, what they frame and what's outside the frame, so what we see, what we cannot see. And that influences our feelings, what is possible feeling-wise, what's not, but also what can be rationalized, what can be articulated, what can not be articulated, what's feasible. You know, and again, the example on torture I mentioned initially. You know, there were no debates on torture, and all of a sudden there were images of torture, of American soldiers torturing. That changed not just the visual field, it changed the parameters of political debate, it changed the parameters of what's rational, what's not, what's feasible. And that's sort of a model that allows us to look at impact of images without going necessarily back to the causal mechanisms that social science usually use. And to me, that's one of the most promising ways forward. It doesn't bring us the certainty that social scientific methods brings, but it brings us a language, a conceptual framework sort of to understand images from iconic ones, but also at the banal level in terms of what are patterns of visualizations that shape us into anything from gender-wise, the clothes we wear and how that frames behavior and gender interactions. That's all visual, but it's a lot more than visual. It's linked to a lot of other symbols and language and other aspects.
Thank you for that, Roland. We're getting quite close on time. I know Lady Day would like to say something. So would you like to make a point or question?
Thank you very much for this presentation. I guess it's probably a comment, but also a question if only that I'm still trying to formulate. Michael, you talked about the social location, and I think that's very important when you start thinking about symbolism, because that's something that we do not talk about when we talk about the Muhammad cartoons. It was the text in the cartoons that gave that symbolism. And just referring to two images that we saw today, Simone, you had the image of the strangulation or the beheading of the man. There was a caption there, it was written in Arabic. When I read that image changed for me because of the context that it gave me. And I think the other image was Lincoln, the one before the iconic soldier. And that was the image that you very quickly, but when I saw that, it resonated with me because it was the massive image, the hands behind him, but the way he had his legs is the way that all Muslims have their legs when they pray. So that gave me a different context, and immediately I connected with that. So it's symbolism, you know, and it's coming back to your point, Michael, it's the construction of the truth, in the sense that when we are looking scientifically at deciphering the images, what measure are we looking at? So, yeah, I'm still thinking about how do we go about this? Is there a linear truth, or are there many truths? You know, different truths based on the symbolism, based on the social location, based on the context.
Yeah, who would like to?
Well, I mean, if I sort of, respond to that quickly, I think that the theoretical status that those symbols will be allocated depends on what different theoretical ontological assumptions you go to the study of images with, right? So in that sense, I don't think that that's exclusively an empirical question. There will be some approaches, semiotic approaches that would give a different status to symbols than a more post-structuralist position that I come from, where the symbol has to be politically mobilized, it has to be given an interpretation, but it also has to be granted a status, right? So it's not just what the symbol means, but it's also making it a political priority to respond to it. So I think in that sense, it's a really great common question, and again, it's one that one can't really answer without also making a set of theoretical ontological assumptions. And just if I can end on that note of pluralism that Roland also started us on, and I think that's also, at least for me, what's so fascinating about this research agenda. Right? It opens up questions about the relationship between some very concrete methodological decisions and some really deep theoretical, ontological, but also political theorizations. And that's why it's both. I think it's important, but it's also what is I think why we're doing this work.
So, any of the other panelists? We had a nice finish for Roland from Roland a moment ago. But anyone else who's not would like to come back and add anything to the comments before we wrap up? Michael, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think everyone's comments have been really wonderful. The really interesting thing for me is if we put all this in the context of a rapidly changing media ecosphere, right, which we're all familiar with, then how do these things begin to become points of political struggle? And not just political struggle in some kind of nice agonistic way, but political struggle in a much, much more targeted, in many of the ways I think that Simone is talking about, but that is now vastly more complicated and indeed often well thought out than that. So what we've got to begin to do here is also link it up to certain conceptions of very, very strategic agency. Yeah. And I think until we can do that, we can't actually find a lot of the ways in which this stuff is getting mobilized through strange ways, right? I mean, I'm always fascinated, this is a banal thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. I mean, I don't own a smartphone, right? But I ride the train because I don't own a smartphone. I watch people on their phones because that's all people do on the train, right, is play on their phones. And I watch them go through screens, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images on the 5 stops that I ride to go to the University of Sydney. And I'm trying to figure out what the hell is going on here, right? What is your brain processing? What are you seeing? Quite literally, what are you doing? It makes absolutely no sense to me. I'd rather sit there and watch the tunnel go by, right? But it's a really, for me, a real puzzle. And I think it's one that bears some thinking about. Because if one is interested in things like the meme wars, right, then what you've got is an image war that is being constantly fought textually as well, right, and counterpositionally as well. And certainly the one thing that was fascinating about the last American election is the way the right absolutely slaughtered Hillary Clinton in the meme wars, right? I mean, just destroyed her, which was really interesting.
Too interesting, I want to come back on that, but I won't. So Emma or Megan, would you like to come? image?
No, I just think that, I think that's a wonderful point, and I think it sort of points to the, I think the biggest question that we can continue to come back to, and I guess it gets at what I'm thinking about in terms of the question that seems to be that is often asked is, what do images tell us about international relations? And we're sort of always making this like implicit assumption that images tell us something about war, images tell us something, and forgetting that the visual vernacular, the series of images that we are coming to an image with, absolutely means it's not that images tell us something, like we pour so much onto an image and it reflects back. And so that's the point I think that you're really highlighting, and that we need to pay attention to, and not just assume that images are just some other piece of evidence about international events.
So when I was first listening to those 6 fabulous papers, I was trying to make sense as someone who doesn't research really in this space, trying to make sense of it all. And I actually think the philosophy and the aesthetic and the representation and the images actually really gel together extremely well. And I think part of the conversation we've all had in the last couple of hours has helped, I think, to make this very, very, not only very enjoyable, but also a great deal more intelligible, certainly for me anyway. So I'd like you to ask you to join me in warmly thanking our 6 presenters. Not only have we got people from 6 great academics, we've got 4 universities from 3 continents, and we've got 2 collaborative projects. We've had one splendid afternoon, so thank you very much.